I've never believed in ghost stories. I've always been a skeptic, preferring logical explanations for what people call the paranormal. That is, until I moved into a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. It was a simple but cozy place. The building was over 70 years old, and although some areas showed signs of aging, the place was well kept. Everything seemed normal, until the mirror arrived. The mirror was a gift from a coworker, Sarah. She had just renovated her house and for some reason didn't want the old mirror anymore. "It's vintage," she said with a smile as she handed me the heavy wooden frame. It was large, decorated with intricate lore, suggesting it was from another time, a valuable piece. I didn't think much about such things, so I accepted it. When I put it on the wall in the living room, something changed. Not immediately, of course, but gradually. At first, it was just small reflections that didn't make sense. A movement in the corner of my eye that disappeared as soon as I looked directly into the mirror. I thought it was a play of light, a trick of my tired eyes. A few days later, I started to have a strange sensation when I walked into the room, as if I were present. Whenever I passed the mirror, I saw strangely distorted reflections. My face looked different, mostly out of proportion. Later, I started to notice shadows in the background, where there should have been nothing but the shadow. I tried to ignore it. After all, it's common for the mind to play tricks on us, especially in new places. But on Friday night, something happened. I was watching TV, the room lit only by the screen, when I heard a low sound, like breathing coming from somewhere. I turned off the TV and waited. Silence. I thought I had imagined it, until I heard the sound again, this time louder, closer. My heart raced, and when I turned to the mirror, I saw a shadow that wasn't mine reflected in the background. I reminded myself to freeze. The shadow was tall, indistinct, but clearly not part of the room. As I watched, the thing moved, coming out of the background and moving closer to my reflection. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was convinced it was an illusion, a trick of the light or some peculiar angle of the mirror. But at the same time, everything inside me screamed that it had. The shadow began to move closer, slowly, and without a reflection, I saw my own face distorted in terror. I tried to move, but I seemed to be stuck in place. When the shadow was almost beside me in the mirror, the sound of breathing became unbearably loud. I closed my eyes, and the next second I heard a loud noise like glass shattering. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was intact, but the reflection was different. The shadow had disappeared, but there was something wrong with me. The reflection still seemed distorted, as if the mirror was reflecting a version of me that I had not expressed. After that, I could no longer look at that mirror. Every time I walked past it, I felt the presence of something, of someone watching me back. One night, I decided to cover it with a sheet, trying to ignore the growing disturbances the mirror was causing. But the sheet would not stay in place. Every morning when I woke up, it was on the floor, as if it had been ripped off during a week later, I went to see Sarah, desperate for some explanation. When I asked about the mirror, she became visibly uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have given you that," she said, lowering her voice. "I saw things in it too. That's why I felt so uneasy." I tried to ask her more, but she made up her mind to talk. Something about her expression gave me chills. I went home that night with the decision to get rid of the mirror, but something inside me hesitated. It was as if the mirror had some kind of power over me, as if it were connected to something I couldn't yet fully understand. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was inside the mirror, trapped, watching my real self, living my life as I banged on the glass surface, screaming for help. When I woke up, covered in sweat, I knew something needed to happen. I took the mirror and took it down to the basement of my building. There was no more room for it in my apartment. As I walked down the stairs, I felt the weight of the object increase, as if it were resisting. I put it in a dark corner and went back to my apartment. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time. But the next day, when I came home from work, the basement door was ajar, and the mirror was back in my living room. The sight of the mirror back in my living room made my stomach turn. I knew I had left it in the basement, and no one else in the building would have any reason to bring it back. It was impossible. I spent a few minutes just staring at it, trying to figure out what was going on. My first instinct was to try to get rid of it again. I picked up the mirror and, with great effort, carried it to the alley behind the building, where I left it next to the dumpster. I am sure of it. But when I got back to my apartment, it was there again, hanging on the wall as if it had never left. This time, something was different. The mirror seemed darker, as if a black mist was forming inside it. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was getting desperate, so I picked up my phone and called Sarah. I needed answers. When she answered, she said bluntly, "The mirror is back, Sarah. It's here again. What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. I couldn't get rid of it either, she said. "I tried so many times, but it always came back. No matter where I put it, it always came back. Why didn't you tell me this before?" I cried, my desperation turning to anger. "You gave it to me knowing it was cursed? I thought maybe it would be different with you," she whispered. "But now I know better. There's something trapped in that mirror, something ancient, something evil." I stood in silence, trying to process his words. Evil. The word reverberated in my mind. I knew I had to do something. But what? How could I get rid of something that apparently didn't want to be discarded? That night, I tried covering the mirror once more. I used a large bath towel, taping it around the edges. This time, I placed a heavy motion in front of it, just to be safe. However, during the night, I was awakened by a strange noise, like someone was scratching the surface of the glass. I got up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I knew where the sound was coming from. When I turned on the light, I put a towel on the floor and the motion pushed aside. The mirror was clean, but something had changed. My image was there, but behind me, the shadow was clearer than ever. It seemed to be moving, coming toward me. Frightened, I ran out of the apartment. I spent the night in the car, not daring to go back. The next day, I decided to seek help. I went to an antique shop in town, where an older man greeted me. When I mentioned the mirror, his eyes narrowed. "There are stories about mirrors like the one you describe," he said quietly. "Ancient objects that imprison spirits or entities. They're like portals, but a portal you don't want to open." "So what do I do?" I asked curiously, feeling a pang of panic. "You need to find the origin of this mirror. Find out where it came from and, if possible, break the bond it has with this spirit." His words echoed in my mind as I walked back to the apartment. I needed to find out more about this mirror. I started scouring the internet, trying to find any clues about its origin. I didn't find much, but one thing was clear. Objects like these often came from dark places full of history, and the people who owned them usually didn't end well. In the days that followed, my life began to deteriorate rapidly. I could barely sleep, always feeling like something was watching me. The mirror was there, constantly watching me back, with the shadow always present, always closer. Even my reflections began to move independently, gesturing and smiling in ways I would never do. One day, while I was at work, I got a call from Sarah. Her voice was shaky, and she could barely form a coherent sentence. I can't do it anymore. He's here. He's... And then the line went dead. I ran to her house, but when I got there, the door was ajar and the house was silent. The mirror she had given me hung on the wall in her living room, and the air around it felt heavy, dense. Sarah's reflection was inside, trapped, banging desperately against the glass, but without sound. She was trapped in the mirror, and now I knew that if I didn't do something, I would be next. I begged myself to free the mirror once and for all. Yet when I tried to break it, the glass resisted. No tool I used seemed to even scratch its surface. It was as if it were protected by a force beyond comprehension. That night, I decided to burn the mirror. I placed it in a barrel in the backyard, doused it with gasoline, and lit a match. The coals went up, but the mirror remained intact, as if the fire avoided it. It was useless. It could not be destroyed. The flames around the mirror quickly died out, absorbed by the darkness within the glass. Nothing worked. The shadow, once a distant presence in the reflection, was now closer. I could almost make out a face, pale, featureless, with black eyes that stared at me with baleful interest. Suddenly, an idea occurred to me. Sarah had mentioned something about the origin of the mirror. If I could find out where it came from, perhaps I could find a way to break the connection with the entity. I returned to the apartment, deciding to investigate further. After hours, I found something disturbing. This family, according to reports, practiced dark rituals, trying to communicate with the other side. The mirror was a tool in these rituals, a portal to imprison spirits. But something went terribly wrong. Instead of controlling what was on the other side, they opened a door that should never have been opened. Determined to put an end to this, I decided to visit the house where the mirror had been found. It was in ruins, abandoned for decades. The road leading up to it was practically overgrown with vegetation, as if the place itself wanted to disappear. When I finally arrived, the atmosphere was oppressive. The walls of the house were covered in moss, and the air smelled of mold and decay. I went up to the second floor, where I found the room where the mirror had originally been located. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the melted candles lay scattered across the floor, long forgotten. In the center of the room, an empty pedestal, the place where the mirror would once stand. As I scanned the room, I felt a familiar presence. I looked toward the dusty window, and there stood the shadow, more defined than ever, with empty, cold eyes fixed on me. I knew that if I wanted to put an end to this, I would need to destroy the symbols and the connection that linked the mirror to the entity. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought and began to destroy the pedestal and the symbols carved into the walls. With each blow, I felt as if the house was vibrating, almost alive. The air around me grew thick, and strange sounds began to echo off the walls, like screams of pain and lamentation. The shadow began to move, as if to stop me, but I continued, ignoring the fear that was growing inside me. With the last blow, a deafening scream filled the air. The entire house seemed to shake. The shadow dissipated, and silence filled the room. Something had changed. I left the house without looking back, feeling the weight of a victory that I still didn't fully understand. When I got to my car, my hands were dirty and shaking, but I was alive. I thought I had won. I went back to my apartment, hoping it was all over. When I entered, I looked into the living room and saw the mirror still hanging on the wall. However, something was different. The surface, once clear and reflective, was now covered in fine cracks, as if it had been corroded from the inside. The shadow had disappeared. My reflection was the only one visible, and despite the evident fatigue, it seemed normal. I covered the mirror one last time, and this time something seemed to have truly changed. The feeling of being watched was gone. The oppressive weight had vanished. In the days that followed, the nightmares stopped and life returned to normal. But intervening in the silence of the early morning, I heard a faint whisper, an almost imperceptible sound, like distant breathing, coming from behind the mirror. Even though everything seems peaceful now, a part of me knows I'll never be completely free. The mirror is still there, waiting.